Welcome, Jim. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Natasha.
Thank you for coming on. I want to get right into it because I know that you have a lot of knowledge and people need to hear from you. So, why don't you tell everybody your story?
I do have a lot of knowledge, not just because I'm older, but because the person who supervised my research into Indian education policy, as it was called, into Indigenous educational history, was none other than the father of our current Prime Minister, Mark Carney. His name was Dr. Robert Carney. And so his views became my views. And Dr. Carney was very supportive of Indigenous schooling. In fact, he was the principal of one school and also ran all schools in the Northwest Territories for a time, which is why Mark Carney was born in the Northwest Territories.
Okay. I see. I didn't know. That's a very interesting connection. I've been to the Northwest Territories. I don't know if he was born in what is still the Northwest Territories or has become none of it.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And that's the line that I use to my students, how Native people wanted all of Canada back, but they got none of it.
Yeah.
So anyhow, they're just trying to keep things light. Of course, keep things light is not an easy thing to do in this world because people are out there to get you. That's sort of what happened to me. So I won't say this at length. I come from a political family. My father was a politician, Roy McMurtry, and Chief Justice, and involved in the patriation of our Constitution in 1981 and 82. And I didn't aspire to notoriety like my father, but I ended up falling into it, or it was thrust upon me by saying the wrong thing in class one day. And that was almost 5 years ago. And what I said was something that I think most Canadians know now, that they haven't found any graves, any unmarked graves, mass graves. They haven't found any missing children. They haven't found any evidence of teachers murdering students. And yet at the time,
I'm just going to interrupt for a second because for people who might not be, I think most Canadians would be aware, but for any American viewers, what happened was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but there was a study put out with ground penetrating radar that said that it found some anomalies. It never said graves. It found some anomalies. And then somehow this was misconstrued to be mass graves. And then the media ran with it. All the legacy media in Canada ran with it. And various academics ran with it. And then this narrative was created that residential schools where Indigenous students were sent were basically torture and slaughter farms, essentially.
I think that's a beautiful description. If you got American people watching, they would know about this as well because it went around the world. Canada, became a wailing wall from every school corridor, every building. Everything was about mourning for 215 children. There was only one person, and it was a professor, who said that she found GPR targets, indications that suggested to her it was 215 children. Now you wonder why, how can they all be children? Well, because she said they were shallow graves. Well, maybe they weren't graves. And turns out that they're very likely one of two things. And it could be tree roots, it could be rocks, could be lots of things. But it looks like it's a 1924 sewage trench that she found. But at the school in Kamloops in British Columbia, there never was any parent ever saying that his or her child didn't come home, it was lost, it was missing. The school never said that. There were only 51 children that ever died in a 100-year history, and those that did, and of course tragically, numbered 51, and most of the deaths were, as you can imagine, going back 100 years from disease such as tuberculosis. So it became this credible mania. It was similar to what happened in the United States with George Floyd. Maybe we'll go back further in the 50s with the Senator McCarthy, where all of a sudden everybody gets together and becomes quite full of hatred, almost demoniacal, maniacal, almost just it's like an Orwellian hate, 2 minutes of hate, where just everybody's just, how can this happen? And just all that energy got turned not toward helping Indigenous people, but toward rooting at anybody who didn't go along with the false narrative. So in classroom one day, I just simply said that, something that I studied, I did a PhD at the University of Toronto, touched on this, that the kids that died did so tragically from disease and sometimes fires and accidents, and but not murder, and to have teachers secretly murdering and then getting 6-year-olds in the middle of the night to bury 215 murdered children in one school. So, of course, the whole thing's preposterous. And yet everybody in Canada, it seemed, went along with it, thought that they were teachers. Now, of course, at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, for, like in any one of these schools, it was right in the middle of the reserve. So the cooks and the cleaners and the dormitory supervisors and at times the teachers, and in fact, one of the principals, the Kamloops Indian Residential School was Indigenous. So the idea, and then parents were all around, and again, the heart of reserve, right in the heart of the city. This idea that there'd be all this, genocide taking place and nobody would notice for 60 to 100 years or longer. It's just, the whole thing anyhow is of course quite absurd. And then people came in and said there was 25,000 or more, including the person who's an Order of Canada recipient, Murray Sinclair, who said that, it could be that many or more that were disappeared by men and women who gave their lives up to teaching kids and who weren't doing well, were illiterate and illiterate and living in remote areas, didn't have many opportunities. It's sort of not your standard recruitment ground for serial killers and nuns with guns. But anyhow, so this is what people believed. In the next year, in 2022, the Canadian government supported a recommendation, which is just an absolutely incredible resolution, that Canada committed genocide through the residential school project. And the reason that to me is particularly upsetting is because I'm fighting my case saying, the year before I didn't say anything wrong, and then everybody's going on about genocide. So of course it wasn't genocide. It was what they were supposed to do, which is to educate. And even the very biased report on this, called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, talked about good intentions, good accomplishments, and about 80% of the testimony was positive. And in some kids, I would say this is true probably right across North America. But one of the things visited upon Indigenous people by history was poverty. Now, they may have always been poverty relative to the standards of other groups, but but certainly there, 150 years ago, there was tremendous suffering and hunger out west. And it was out west where the vast majority of these residential schools were, and in isolated areas and so forth. And people couldn't, hunt and fish as before. The land was taken over by farmers, and buffalo were disappearing, if not completely gone. And so it was tough. The government thought that this is the way to help them, that they provided massive programs of food relief and obviously law and order through our mounted police and hospitals and all sorts of things. But most important in the eyes of both government and these communities was, we want our children to have a better future. And you can't do that without putting them in school. And what better place to put a child? Again, to educate that child would be with other children and under the tutelage of highly educated people. And it would have been lovely if you could have had day schools in every single community in the north and west of Canada. But that wasn't realistic, because sometimes it was a band of 50 people that was nomadic. So children, like today, all 3 of my children went away to go to university. There wasn't a university in the community in which we were living. And so, and it's not uncommon. I have taught many kids through middle school and high school who are from Korea in particular. So the parents send them here for educational opportunities. So I don't think there's anything nefarious about residential schools from beginning to end. There was only one priest that was ever convicted. Now people say, oh, well, that's because the police were so corrupt. Well, I don't think that's true. And I know it's hard to convict people of sex crimes. My point is this: if it was, they've convicted many people in the last, like Mount Cashel, which is an orphanage in Newfoundland, in St. John's. They made many arrests and they had over 100 convictions. So it's not as though Canada didn't convict people who are guilty of sex crimes. It's just that a school is a place where there's many sets of eyes at all times. It's a pretty actually hard place, and particularly this Kamloops Indian Residential School, again, was in the middle of a city, middle of the reserve, and there were people from the government going in and out, nurses, doctors, plumbers, all sorts of people. And so it's, it's not a story that's real, but there have been ghost stories about this that have been around for a long time. And we all know about urban legends. And one of them in this thing was that the Queen with her husband, Queen Elizabeth II, and her husband visited in 1964, and they kidnapped 10 children. And those children were never seen again. Now, there are people who are saying in schools, and this is the argument used against me, is that I can't say anything that's going to cause emotional harm, upset to Indigenous kids in particular. So just even saying what I'm saying to you would be cause enough for me to no longer be teaching. And when I was walked out 4.5 years ago, I haven't taught since. I'm finished as a teacher because I was telling the kids that they weren't, use your term earlier, where these weren't death camps. They weren't houses of horror. They were schools, and the people that condemn them don't have any understanding how horrible it would be for those children not to have had any education at all.
Yeah, I think there's a really lacking theory of mind nowadays when it comes to looking at history, and a lack of imagination as well, and a lack of baseline knowledge. So Canada is the second largest country in the world. It's half the size of Russia. And a lot of these communities were extremely remote. Like they're remote. There are communities that are extremely remote today with planes, with everybody owning a car almost, with a lot more access today. They're still remote. So it wasn't possible for people, as you mentioned before, to be sent to set up day schools. And many of the communities were tiny. And as you said, some moved. So that was out of the question. So the residential schools were effectively boarding schools. I know people who've gone to boarding school for various reasons, sometimes because their parents lived abroad. And so they were sent back to boarding school in Canada. Nobody would have considered that the parents were abusive. Generally, in this case, these parents are more on the affluent side, and they're trying to give their children the best education. But in the case of the residential schools, the span is very long through history. And in the early years, many children died from disease, not just Indigenous children. Children died from disease fairly frequently. And sanitation was not great. And even today, there are high rates of communicable diseases on reserves. So I find it frustrating for many reasons. It's the lack of knowledge. It's replacing knowledge with emotion. And then, as you mentioned before, if the standard for a teacher is not to emotionally upset a student, then you're really more of like an emotional support dog than an educator. Like that can't be the standard. Children sometimes are very volatile. That cannot be the standard. The standard needs to be a teacher doing his job. That's the standard, educating, teaching the children critical thinking methods, giving them the information that they need, giving them various points of view so that they're able to arrive at a conclusion themselves. That's the standard. But being an emotional support dog that's not even quantifiable. So so how have things come along, like in that regard? Are you making any progress
Yeah.
with?
Oh, you said so many wise things, and I just have to quickly latch onto two of them, if I may. One, the people are saying that, well, more kids died in these schools and in other schools at the time. And that's true, because the kids, in large part, in some cases entirely, went to these isolated schools from reserves where almost everybody had tuberculosis. So they took the disease with them, and so yes, they became cesspools of infection. But it was also at those schools where there were people who were teaching hygiene, who were vaccinating children, who were teaching them the things that, most things like washing hands and so forth, and being provided again with nurses and doctors and nearby hospitals. And so this idea that it was a bad place is wrong. But what people never do is they never say, well, what was the comparison between kids that were taken off the reserve compared to those that are at the schools? Well, the kids that were taken off the reserve had a better survival rate.
Yeah.
Obviously, because they had many of the kids that came from the reserves and these schools were there were taken. I mean, minority were taken because they didn't have the necessities of life. They were being abused. They were hungry. They're orphans, and they were taken and put in these schools. So over time, the schools became less for education in some cases, and much more of a sort of child services refuge. And so the schools did, like, that's our schools today. Our schools today do all sorts of things. If their kid comes to school today and there's no food, they'll find that there's a food program at the school. If a child needs mental counseling, that there's, mental counselors that are available. And if a child, doesn't have any shoes for gym class, there'll be a program for that. I mean, there are lots of things that are done in school to support children, as are done in these residential schools. So the first thing is, it's sort of like the trans thing. People say, oh, kids that are depressed, therefore they need to change their body. They need to go from girl to boy or boy to girl, and because they're depressed. These trans kids are ones that are identifying that. And Jim, how come you don't understand that as a teacher? And then you want to make the obvious point. You want to say, well, maybe there could be a little bit more depressed afterwards, after, having body parts cut off, after realizing that they're sterile. People generally don't like being mutilated. Maybe that could lead to more. And people don't. It's just the stupidest straw man arguments that they put up to try and justify something, which is, to me, is just an indication of their own ignorance and illiteracy. So the second thing I wanted to say very quickly, and I think it's a really important thing, is who am I? I am, educated in the area, as said. I come from a family where people really did know Canadian history. So I think I'm an expert of sort. I'm sure there are people who are more expert, but I'll stand up in an argument with anybody. And I don't call people names, and I don't run away. I listen to people, and if they have something that's better than what I have to say, or if they know more, then it informs me, and it makes me a bit more educated on the subject. That's not how it works with me. What works is me. I know more than most Canadians on this area. That's just my only area of expertise, and I can't teach anyone. Because anyone, whether it's my family or my friend or, friends, it doesn't matter. Somebody at a restaurant, it doesn't matter if I get into this, right away I'm a racist, and they're walking away and huffing and puffing, and they don't, as you said earlier, they don't want to know anything. So the second thing I really want to say is this: look at me. I'm just an older teacher. I can't work anymore. I can't get work anywhere because I was telling kids the truth. I think that's a pretty strong indictment of a democracy when you get rid of the teachers who are being honest, and you promote and succor all the teachers. There was one teacher in Oakville, Ontario, who put on prosthetic breasts, fake boobs all the way down to his waist, and nipples that were very large, and did all these things that were just to obviously be sexually alluring for the boys in his shop class. It was all very homoerotic and disturbing. And the whole educational establishment, oh, this teacher has, it's trans, let's trans people have rights. It's a human rights issue. How dare you criticize that? And then I say something that is factual, and that teachers weren't murdering all these kids. You think that'd be a good thing for kids to saying?
Yeah.
And among other things, people were saying that I've singled out Indigenous people and Indigenous children that I've harmed. That's what my poor, the Abbotsford School District is saying, above all else, and my regulatory body and my government and all the other people who want to see me hanging from a tree. It's all the same thing. And I mentioned at the beginning, and as did you, in anticipation. It's this idea that it's no longer about truth. It's everybody can have his or her own truth. And Indigenous people, they have their own way of knowing. And that now counts in law. And so some people are getting large chunks of Canadian territory on the basis of saying, well, I think, my grandmother's grandmother said to her, that we used to live here and we used to go over there. And all of a sudden, people are losing their basic private, rights to private property for people on the basis of hearsay and complete old wives' tales, and we call it, it's oral culture, and it's something that we need to enshrine. And the school system, I've heard many people say that Indigenous knowing is not only equal to but better than science. And so it's pretty hard to compete with that. And I refuse to be deceiver of children. I refuse to be a Pied Piper who leads children away from their parents and toward some sort of uncertain end. I think my job is to simply present my subject and do it as fairly and as honestly and as accurately as I'm capable. And let the kids come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, that's what teaching used to be. I mean, I'm old enough that I didn't know how my teachers voted. That used to be the standard. Nobody discussed that in class when I was being educated. The teachers taught the topics. I didn't know about their personal lives. I didn't know even what their favorite color was. They came in and they tried to impart knowledge. They tried to get us up to speed on the topic. And I don't think I'm any worse for that. What's happening in the schools now. I just wanted to add this. I'm going to bring this up on the screen, because what you're saying is making me think of this. It's making me think of communism. 1 second. So I don't know if people can see or not, but the post says the four olds were targets of destruction during China's Cultural Revolution, led by Chairman Mao Zedong. The goal was to uproot traditional Chinese culture and values to pave the way for a new communist society. The four olds are old customs, old culture, old habit, and old ideas. And I think that's what's happening. We have, history is being erased.
Well, it's very intentional, and it has to be erased because you can't manipulate, you can't brainwash people who have who have cognitive dissonance. Well, no, hold on a second. I remember, no, we learned how to read. We didn't have flags with colors we had to memorize. We didn't have people saying, here, take this, puberty blocker, here, bind your chest, here, bind your groin, boys. It wasn't like that. But, my gosh, the things that really stand out for me, if I could just say really quickly, are these 6 things. All the stuff about gender and sex, I just don't understand, because I never went through elementary school talking about that stuff. And you know what? I just think it is just so incredibly offensive to enter into a child's sexuality. The second one is the race stuff. That's just as bad. A child can't do anything about skin pigment. And the same way a child can't do anything about religion. A child can't do anything about all these identities and The indigenization is really upsetting because they come with daily land acknowledgments. They come with this idea, as I said, that their way of knowing is better than ours. And then the kids study, instead of senior English, they're now doing it in First Peoples course, where they're learning how to make a bone fish hook, and how to make a canoe from birch bark, or clothing from birch bark, and some are from cedar bark. And some kids in class go, how is that better? I mean, of course, the kids, you're not making Indigenous people feel better about themselves, because you're only teaching about them hundreds of years ago, when there wasn't metal, and there wasn't the material stuff that we have today. So the people who are doing this, whether they're communists, these equity people who want to just bring down the successful and raise up everybody else and really create a social chaos, so that they can emerge or they can prosper. Like that was Charles Manson, the serial killer's dream, that he was going to create a race war between the killings that he did, was to try and get white people to hate black people and black people to hate white people, and create a race war. And I think that's what's happening in Canada. You've got all these different groups. These ones get advantages that the other ones don't, and these ones were horrible, oppressive, colonialist settler monsters. And these other group, they lived in an Eden or whatever, or that they're much better philosophy, much better religion. And so there's very much this sort of thing. So I just want to say there's six things. And so the fourth one I want to talk about really quickly, this is they're really tearing apart all the academic values that were ever there. This idea that kids had to do homework, and the kids had to memorize, and content was important, and critical thinking mattered, and the child was able to be the flower that he or she grew up to be, and not the same flower the same thinker everybody else was. So there's a real assault on all Western Enlightenment values. The fifth thing I want to mention just very quickly is that about literature. So when I went to school, and I'm just me, but I think, a lot of people are like this, that a lot of stuff in school is boring. and that's just by its very nature. I teach French right now, among other subjects. And I used to when I was teaching, and I fell asleep during French class and quit after grade 9 or whatever. And I learned it later, but I was bored at the time. And so now when I was teaching French class years later, I became very conscious of how do I make it interesting? Because you can make a subject interesting because there's, of course, tremendous power and joy that comes from being able to speak another language. And so I think English teachers have the best job in some way, because they get to not teach English, because a lot of them don't even do grammar anymore or writing with kids. They read books. And some of the books I read, like To Kill a Mockingbird, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or Holes, or I mean, there's so many books, The Outsiders, that I can give some examples in French as well. But but there's so many great stuff. It's gone because it's harmful, because it's going to make some kids emotionally upset. You said earlier about it's like teaching classrooms have become these emotional rubber rooms, where everything has to be safe, and every idea has to go through all these different, lenses or whatever, filters, before it can be ever said in a classroom. And if a teacher says something untoward, then everybody in the system goes, how dare you use that word? And of course, you could use the N word. Well, if you were teaching To Kill a Mockingbird 10 years ago, and nobody would think anything of it, because you're working with senior students and you're teaching a book that was very much against racism. I don't think there's a better book with better characters than Scout Finch and Atticus, her father, and Boo Radley and Tom Robinson and so forth. I mean, anyhow, all these books are just gone. And there's one school board in southwestern Ontario, francophone school board, called the Conseil Scolaire de Providence. And they actually had a ritual burning of books. The sixth thing and the last thing I'll say is about the defamation of history, that they really are, it's not just cutting our kids off from history and not teaching about history. It's that they're changing history. Mm-hmm. And that was Winston Smith in 1984. His job every day was to go back and find old magazines and change words. That's what they're doing right now. They just keep changing history books, to the point in schools they don't have history books, because they can't afford it. Because every year now, some moralistic prig who's a complete hypocrite, people who are in many cases highly immoral, they pretend in schools that kids have to have. You talked about old speak in that quote you're talking about, Cultural Revolution. They got to get rid of old speak, old language, all that kind of stuff. And the new language is reductive and less. You can't say this word, you can't say the R word, and you can't say the S word, and you can't say the F word, you can't say. And it's just unbelievable how many words and phrases you can no longer say in school. And you realize after a while, they're doing the same thing to history. There's all sorts of things about history you can't say. So if the story that really struck me the most, which I think was a beautiful story. And then again, this last thing I was saying, because I tend to ramble because I haven't been able to teach for so long, and is that there was, there were Christian men and women who came to Canada long before almost anybody else. And they built the first schools and hospitals and so forth. And they had different names from like the Jesuits and their sons and so forth. Well, two of those Jesuits in 1649 were helping to educate and civilize in their understanding, and Christianize, whether it's right or wrong, any of it. They believe that they're doing something right and making life, better. And they had an opportunity to escape because the people realized that their enemies were coming to get them. And they decided to stay with the people. And they didn't fight back against the Iroquois that came. And they were burned at the stake. And they suffered terribly. And they had parts of them eaten and other barbarities. And we used to learn about that when I was a kid. And their names were Brébeuf and Lademont. And there's schools named after these priests still in Canada. You can't mention that now. Because it's wrong in every way. It's wrong. You're celebrating Christianity. That's wrong. You're talking about violence. That's wrong. Unless it's, of course, woke violence, which means you can go to town talking about all the people that are killed by white policemen. But the moment you talk about, and it's wrong as well because Indigenous people aren't presented, as glorious people living in their own Eden, and yet that's what history was. If you go back 400 or 500 years ago, it was Darwinian. It was this, struggle for survival.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of really interesting points. I made a few notes just so I would remember. I think there are two of the many interesting points you made that are standing out to me is that as history is being rewritten and whitewashed to serve certain special interests, at the same time, the layers and complexity and human element of history is being removed. So I think back to my own family history. I'm, if you want a prototypical Canadian, I would be it. I have a little bit of everything, a lot of Scottish blood, I have Cree blood, I have French blood, I have a little bit of all of it. English, of course. But I had relatives who, I guess they would be Métis, and they were living in, very trying circumstances. And this idea that I think in terms of men and women, because a conservative actually said something to me about how women were oppressed. And I said, well, I think back to this one relative of mine. She was a medicine woman. She married a Scot. He went out to get provisions. Snow came in. They were living on the prairies. It was total whiteout. He didn't know how long the snow would last. So he eviscerated one of his horses and he dug himself into the carcass of the horse to keep his body heat, to keep himself alive. And then when the snow cleared, he went home to his wife and she had to chop his toes off. So these people were tough. The women were tough then. They weren't these dainty little, dainty women who weren't, all in the family. Like the husband and the wife, the children, everybody was all in because they needed to be to survive. And now when we look back at history with like more of a feminist lens, it's, oh, the women were oppressed, the men were the oppressors. And then we have the same oppressor-oppressed lens. The Europeans came, they were the oppressors, and the indigenous were the oppressed. And it's a disservice as well to indigenous history, because there are hundreds of different tribes. Some were pacifists, some were vicious barbarians who would cannibalize other tribes. So this is all, it's very interesting. And I think that children would be captivated learning the truth of indigenous peoples in Canada, and then the various Europeans who came, how it was different amongst, the Scottish versus the British versus the Irish. It's really, really interesting. And when history is reduced to being oppressor and oppressed, and it's not even accurate in terms of who the oppressor and the oppressed is, because that would of course change over time and tribe to tribe and situation to situation. It's just this very reductionist, really boring version of history that also incites people to hate each other. So on so many levels, it's just, it's sad. I love history. I studied history, not to the degree that you did, but I studied liberal arts, and then I studied political science and history. And I've always found it really fascinating. And it's robbing children really of the ability to look at time and look at people and think of all the things that we've accomplished and how that happened. What cultures are better than others, because some objectively have better features than others. What works in different places. What has been borrowed or adapted. These are really interesting questions about human nature and about accomplishments and achievements. And it's just reduced to this kind of grotesque caricature.
And the grotesque caricature has to be such that the teacher's not going to get in trouble for.
I don't even know how you would do that, though.
Accused of.
Yeah.
So it's such a hard is a minefield for teachers right now, because at any time people can come from the political left or the political right or anywhere, and simply say to you, what you're doing is wrong, and you're in trouble. And I look at, when I was I lived in Europe for a number of years, and so I felt that I got a little bit of a grounding in a lot of Roman based languages, and one thing I learned was that the Italian word for knowing or to know is sapere. And then I looked and then saw that it's the root of the Roman word for science is to know. And I thought, here I am as an adult, not knowing for all these decades that the word science is about knowing. And I think it's kind of interesting as well. And then you have in Greek, there are people who believe, and there are people who don't really believe, called agnostics. But Gnosticism is knowing. Anyhow, so we have different words, but this idea of so much of the language, education is about development and training and leading out, in its root sense. So much of what we do in a school and what we do in a society with children is to get them to know. And if they don't know, well, they may not have a full life, because there are just so many dangers out there. So I think I have a really hard time with just the general notion is that we are blessed or invested with the power to decide what kids can know and can't know. I think that becomes very dangerous, because if you keep kids unaware of opposing views, unaware of contrary information, of counterpoints, then they become really susceptible to going and fighting in a war. If they don't understand that, that maybe the just cause lies more with the opponents, or maybe both sides are wrong, or whatever. So I think we should in the very beginning see value in knowing. And I know some parents don't want certain things, kids to know certain things, and teachers don't, and government doesn't want kids, are knowing how to make a bomb. I get that. But I think most knowledge is good, and it's really how you, I don't think you can hide it, even how to make a bomb. Or even reading Hitler's Mein Kampf on the internet, or all these things people say are wrong. I don't know if they're wrong. If they're intrinsically, yes, but I mean, if they're part of society, if it's something that people are going to meet, if there are tigers on the street, kids need to know about the habits of tigers. It doesn't help them to be in rooms where they're handed teddy bears and all these, very soft, inanimate and pleasant looking, completely harmless.
I think what you're saying is children need to learn how to contend with the world and to contend.
You said better.
To contend with different ideas, and they need to learn how to analyze. Because I think also if children aren't given source materials, which seems to be the way nowadays, like I'm of the generation that when you studied history, you studied source materials. You didn't study an opinion about an opinion about an opinion about the source materials. You read the source materials. So if you were going to study the National Socialist Workers' Party in the 1930s and 40s, which is the Nazis, you read Mein Kampf because that was the source material. And you had to go back through the various source material and contextualize and understand it. And I think it almost, when children are treated like they can't contend with anything, it makes them weak. It makes them fragile because they're actually not exposed to much. So the less you're exposed to, the more jarring it will be when you are exposed to it. But it also robs them of the ability to develop discernment. I like to think that I'm able to read various types of material and understand what's propaganda and what isn't. But if I was never exposed to any of it, perhaps I wouldn't be. Like, this lack of exposure to different ideas is very bizarre in the educational field. But I wanted to do one thing, because this came up on X, and you were talking about teachers and school and everything. And Frances Widdowson, I believe you know her, right? And she was assaulted, like, at a university on Friday, I think. And she was going to have a discussion, was she not? Like, going to have a conversation?
Yeah, she calls it street epistemology. It's a big word, just simply is getting people on the street, asking what their views are about a contentious issue, and putting them opposite each other, and then asking them questions and providing them with information, just so to see who changes based on hearing what somebody else has to say.
Almost like a debate.
Yeah, but she's very affirmative. Like, if people have a different view from her, she's, well, that's wonderful and so forth. Thank you very much, and let's listen to this person, and this is what I think. And so there's no condemnation. And the video clip that I put out on my X was about, I don't know if you're going to show it.
I'm going to add I didn't put yours up, but it might be hers. I'll add.
It doesn't matter. I mean, it's all Frances. She's
yeah. This is. Can I play it?
Oh my gosh! Please.
Okay, I'll play it.
They put a fence around the area. They asked them like they were going to have
you guys, because
and
you
then they
didn't
haven't
know
done
this.
anything. For sure.
And why?
And I tried because it set off the entire thing.
We don't live there. We have never been there. We have never been there.
But in terms of the apple orchard, you know that the only way we can determine
I'm just going to move it forward a little bit.
Yeah, it gets. There's ones where she's knocked to the ground.
Oh my gosh, I didn't see that. I saw this lady yelling in her face.
Don't get her garbage, you fucking spew out your mouth. No, I'm fucking white privilege.
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah. You're a piece of shit.
It's so it's very jarring to me, even though when I report, I meet people who are like this, who are filled with hate. and vitriol, but it's something about seeing like this nice lady. It's just,
And you're an embarrassment because you were fired.
No one invited you.
I didn't say that.
No one invited you.
Nobody
Go
wants you.
home.
so that gives people, I'll look for yours as we talk, but that gives people an idea of what teachers and professors are facing on campuses now. I don't know who that deranged woman is. She doesn't look like she's student age to me.
There's the last one. You can go on, Francis. You can go on to my
Okay, I'll go look.
and it's the last one I posted, and it's unbelievable the things are being said. And while you're doing that, if I could just quickly say that my employer is in saying that I should never teach again. And its argument is no longer about the fact that I was saying the right thing in school. They recognize that, so they're trying to find something out. And they're saying that even though I was saying the right things to kids, and they didn't put it in that way, but even they even say it wasn't what you said. It was that I didn't give time for the students to process the information and have a safe space in which to absorb it. And the information that the school was giving them was about mass murder by teachers at a residential school, which is all false. So you'd think I was doing the right thing by telling them, no, it didn't happen, kids.
Yeah, guess what, kids? There wasn't mass murder.
It was better to tell kids a lie about something that's incredibly scary for them. And I know it's scary. My 3-year-old went to daycare. My 3-year-old grandson went to daycare and was told about residential schools and came home to his mother.
He was told about that at daycare?
Oh gosh, yeah. They're getting the kids younger and younger all the time. This is, of course, what Hitler and Mussolini did. And he just turned 3 at his daycare. And he's going home and telling him about residential schools. Mommy, am I going to be kidnapped and taken away from my family, have my hair cut and so on? And what's interesting is you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to scare kids with these ghost stories about genocide and all these things. But if you're a teacher like me, who is simply saying things that are factual, you are a monster. And you have to, you're like a cancer that people don't want to metastasize. So you've got to get rid of. Frances is, is a professor who lost her job for the same thing as me, just being truthful about our history. And she goes there. She wouldn't hurt a fly. Frances and I have disagreed on things, and we do it in the most civil way. And she's an amazing lady. You'll find this quite shocking. You can move it up a little bit.
Okay, I'll okay.
Can you move it up? Keep going, about halfway. So Frances at this point is lying down on the ground. I think that's her as a defensive, and you'll see why.
They dragged me. Get off of me! 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 Get up! Get off of me! Get up! Bitch! Oh no, she's gonna lie down. Run! Here we go! Oh my God! She's laying down now. Custer's last stand! Look at her! She's so privileged!
You're gonna put someone in a headlock again.
Here you go. I got a blanket for you. My children want to every day. This is what children want to every day, but worse.
You're lying, man.
Your people brought to us.
That's where you belong. That's where you belong. That's where you belong. You belong right there. Right there. Underground. You belong underground. What you did to our kids, our ancestors. What you guys did to them.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't the clip that I was hoping you'd play. I don't, and I apologize for thinking.
That's okay. I mean, that's disturbing enough. There are people
Yeah,
threatening her.
so this is a woman who's completely surrounded and being jostled and being told things. I can tell you some of the lines. One of them is that she's uninvited and to go the F back home. Another one is that you should not just be on the ground, you should be underground, under the ground. And so, and then of course lots of other things are just really uncivil. This is happening at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. But nobody's coming to her rescue. And
like, why isn't the university getting these people off the campus? They're obviously not students. Some of these women are 40 and 50 years old. They're agitators and they're assaulting somebody.
They didn't come to her rescue. So, and this is what she's met time and again. So I think, when our universities, they preach safe spaces, they have safe spaces for Indigenous young people, because Indigenous people, who of course were very proud, incredibly tough people to make it in this landscape, going back hundreds of years, incredibly tough, heroic, valiant people, being reduced to snowflakes, to emotional basket cases, emotional hemophiliacs, that they can't take anything. So they have all these safe spaces and all these things that, don't worry about, they don't have to do this. They go to law school. They don't have to have good marks. They don't have to write the LSAT, the exam to get in. They don't have to have a degree. Just everything is just for them, these little, like they're treated as though they're little infants right through society. It's so incredibly gross and paternalistic. And they do it. But they can turn around and do that to Frances, who's obviously a nonviolent woman who just wants to say something that they don't know, which is what they believe to be true is false. And
what's incredible is they may agree with what she has to say. They don't know what she has to say because she hasn't even spoken yet. They're preventing her from speaking.
And that's the most upsetting thing is when you are taking, it's not just free speech, it's no speech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to show, because there's an aspect that we haven't touched on, but it's important that people outside of Canada know that there have been real world consequences, not just the firing of teachers, not just the firing of professors, not just people being assaulted, but also churches have been burned. There was basically an explosion of arson, burning churches to the ground after the allegations about the mass grave hoax. And the church burnings continue. There was one the other day. And if any other group had their houses of worship targeted this way, this is all that the legacy media would be discussing. It is all that Parliament would be discussing. But because it's the founding culture in Canada, Christians, it seems to be okay to burn these houses of worship to the ground. And the very sad part is that some of the churches were built by Indigenous people for the Indigenous communities. But I'm just going to bring up this was a map that was made from Juno of the church arson. I don't know that it's been updated since, but churches just burned across the country. So at the time that this article was written, it was 118 churches, but it's many more now. And it's a direct cause of this lie about the schools, that they were basically killing camps. It's very sad.
Yeah, one of it's particularly awful because the majority of Indigenous people up until recently were Christian. And now still just slightly under half I still identify as being Christian. So the churches, in most part, that were being burned down were the churches historically of, historic churches within Indigenous reserves that were attended and run by them. And so, yeah, and also with the burning of churches, it's and there was one just last week, so it's not something that's ended. It's obviously it's a really horrible act of hate, and you don't ever hear about arrests, and you don't hear even about investigations, and the politicians are hiding, ducking from the issue. And one of the things that was said to Frances Whittleson was, by a woman right in her face, saying, look what you did, you so-and-so, to my ancestors, to our ancestors. And this wasn't, I don't know if Frances did anything to anyone's ancestors. She's probably just been quietly doing her job at a university. But my point is, what we're doing is we're placing a blood libel on one group of Canadians. And oddly enough, it's the group of Canadians it's the people who've done the most in the whole world for Indigenous people. So when you attack Canadian churches, Christian churches, I can't imagine any people in the world that could compete with the missionary work, with the charity of Christians. And unless there's a religion out there that I've never heard about, and some other planet, whatever, but there's no religion that comes close to the altruism, the social good that springs from Christianity, and it's not just now, but in the past. And that, of course, that's the whole example of Christ. It wasn't about winning converts. It was about doing well unto others. And I just think, how can you do that to people? How can you defame the dead? And that's what these churches represent. It's not that the churches are hurting Indigenous people today. It's just that they're the remnants of what Christians did, to horrible things did to them in the past. And you go back in the past and go, no, it was the opposite. When you were hungry, it was a Christian person who brought you food. When you were cold, it was a Christian person who brought you a blanket. And I mean, it's an inversion, but they do that with language too. These, whatever we want to call this new group has come in, postmodernist, woke, social justice. Sorry, pardon me?
I just call them Marxists.
Marxist, communist, DI, equity, totalitarians, whatever you want to call these people. And they're a large part of, sadly, of our education, our institutional leadership today. But they take words, and Orwell also anticipated this, that they would take words and do the opposite with them. As you know, the famous war is peace, freedom is strength, and ignorance is truth. Freedom is slavery, and ignorance is truth. I mean, they're doing that. So you've got diversity, but of course there's no diversity, inclusion, and someone with my characteristics and your characteristics, even worse, being a older white male, considered male, able-bodied, heterosexual. Like I'm just the enemy to everybody, and Christians, and then you have the worst of all is equity, and equity is the idea that you. Of course, it doesn't apply to minorities. So you have professional sport, which is dominated by blacks, and nobody's saying, "Oh, we need to have more white people, or more Asians, or more people from South America, or more people with 1 foot, or albino, or whatever, or blue eyes, or whatever, on playing professional sport." Nobody does that. So it's only that in the areas where people who look like you and me do well, and say that we. But when you do that, if you create a society, and of course, it just makes sense anymore, because people like me, when I look at the students in my classroom, I go, "Oh my gosh, the strongest students are increasingly kids from Asia." Like, I mean, it's not really a racial thing at all. Of course, it's a cultural thing. The kids that want to succeed the most and who have parents who support them are the ones who will be more successful. So it's really nothing about race. So anyhow, I'm just trying to use that thing. But this idea of equity. So now we're expected to make sure that we are doing equity marking. So you you're in big trouble if you ever fail a kid who's Indigenous or Black, or any other group that at the moment, or Muslim, or whatever, that any group that people think we've got to lift up. And that's what happened in Russia. They took the most successful farmers, called the kulaks, and they said, we're going to create this, communist, everybody is the same. And of course, there's people at the top who only got wealthier. So everybody else thinks, everything is the same. It's like the pigs and animal farm. They become, incredibly much, all animals are equal, except some are more equal than others. And so you kill off all the successful farmers, then everybody's poor and everybody's starving. And that's what our society is. You're only making Canada worse. Better maybe for these, these really dark cultists, dystopians who are wanting to do this to Canada. And people like Trudeau, who came in talking about how Canada was so bad and we should be ashamed of it and we shouldn't even have a country anymore. We should be post national state. And you realize, it's just going to hurt everybody except for the small amount of people who are going to, just watch us in our misery, be completely unaware of what they are doing or what they are drawing from. A lot of these institutions in Canada, look at me. I'm a high school teacher. You make a certain amount of money and it's hard at first because you get paid less when you start. And then you look at the superintendent, and some superintendents are making 10 times that of a starting teacher, 20 times that of a school secretary or custodian or educational assistant. And you go, oh my gosh, that person who's the superintendent of the school system, that person is a teacher. How did they get away with paying themselves so much money? How did they get away with coming up with these horrible ideas?
And the results, the results aren't there. I'm around children a lot. I'm a mom, and it comes up in conversation. I don't quiz children, but it will come up in conversation, various, topical issues. And the baseline of knowledge that children have now is just not there. But it's because what's being focused on, like what you mentioned before, I think it's the great Mark Stein said, the only diversity that matters is the diversity of thought. And that's not the diversity that we have in the classroom anymore. That's verboten. So if children are focused so much on really what is very worldly, like your skin color, your sexuality, faith is not worldly, but all of these attributes that are really worldly, instead of focusing on ideas, they're not training their brains to really absorb when they're at the time in life when they can absorb the most information. And they're not being given a means of classification of information so that they can slot it in so that they have an overarching view of time and of culture. They're just being kind of fed various narratives to make them feel either ashamed or proud, alternating, I would say, or guilty. And they're leaving school without the skill sets. They don't have critical thinking skills. They don't have knowledge. They don't have basic proficiency in different areas. And then the children who do, for whatever reason, maybe they have parents that are more involved. Maybe they're doing extra courses on the side, what have you. Those children are going to end up doing okay. But it's like hampering an entire generation. I was astonished. This is an aside, and I want to put something up here. I'll put this up. We can talk about that a bit before you go. But I was astonished because growing up, we had the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That was on every classroom. We also sang the national anthem every morning. We also said the Lord's Prayer. So I'm dating myself a little bit in that, because while I was in elementary school, there was a charter challenge, and then all of that was taken out of the classroom. But now children, I was astonished to discover, are not taught the national anthem in school anymore. They're not taught the national anthem.
Kids are not taught their times tables. Kids are not taught basic content. I could ask a class of grade 12 students, I said, when did Canada become a country?
And they won't know.
They won't know. I mean, the things that were milestones in an education. The kids brag when they graduate high school. They go, I didn't read a single book. I didn't need to. I use Cole's notes, or I mean, they're proud of the fact that they don't have to have a classical traditional education, that they
Yeah.
completely avoided. And then they all take the classes like social justice. They take the classes where they know they don't have to, or now First People's classes where they know that there's no work, there's no tests, there's no essays, there's just nothing. There's no challenge, there's no discussion. And you just sit and look at your phone and chat with your friend because there's absolutely no instruction of any value.
Yeah. I mean, we see that. You said social justice. It's right on this website. That is this is recommended to parents about tomorrow, the Orange Shirt Day, in the classroom. So it talks about social justice, the topics and themes that are recommended that children learn about are student memorial register, missing children, unmarked burials, intergenerational trauma and healing. So they're still pushing this. They're still pushing the mass graves hoax, basically. And then at the Government of Canada level, this is another recommended source for parents. The tragic legacy of residential schools, missing children, families left behind, survivors of these institutions. So there's an entire day, basically, which is devoted to indoctrinating children into a false narrative about Canadian history. Like, it's in classrooms across the country. It's really, really Marxist. It's really disturbing. And it's a form of emotional abuse, really, because you're impugning everybody who worked at these schools. And I think it might also make them a little bit afraid of their own teachers, if you're like,
make kids go home and talk to their parents. And if their parents don't have the same ideas, they're going to snitch on their parents to their teachers. I mean, there's nobody. And if a teacher doesn't say the right thing, they're going to go to their parents and snitch. We're creating a generation of ideological snitchers, of mics go around everywhere to make sure everybody's politically correct. And politically correct in the inversion. Really what it is politically evil. Because I think it's really wrong to force anything upon people. That's the very opposite of education. Education isn't about compulsion. Education is about opening. The very root sense of education is to lead out. And just before, I know time is short now, so I'd love to tell people that I wrote a book, and the one thing that has attracted people to my book and to my story, it's not so much about really what I represent as someone who's fighting against false narratives and for education as we knew it, and for children's right to an education and so forth, free from indoctrination. It's about that I'm a teacher that's just saying no to everybody. They have tried for 6 years to cut me down to pieces. And 4.5 years ago, they walked me out in front of my students, and I haven't taught since. And 2.5 years ago, they officially fired me. And now they're trying to cancel me my certificate for life. The one thing that I think people are particularly attracted to about me is I'm just a teacher, but I'm not going to bend. I'm insisting that they're all wrong. Our whole society, all our institutions are wrong, and wrong about the race stuff, the gender stuff, the indigenization stuff, the canceling of people, of the daily land acknowledgements, the defaming the dead, deforming our history, banning literature. I go on. My point is this: I'm not changing. So I don't care. They can try and do everything they want, but in the end, people will know that people like you, who is so wonderful having me on, because without social media, and I would never have my story told, that we are going to be the ones that are seen to be right. That children are not to be instrumentalized. That children are children. Let them grow up naturally and normally and healthily. And how dare you indoctrinate and place in their heads these really dark stories about murdering teachers. I couldn't think of anything worse. These kids are sitting up there looking at their teacher going, is the teacher going to murder me now? Yeah. Cut my hair off, starve me and put me on a hook, or put me in an incinerator, or secretly bury my body at night. Like, it's just so sinister. So this is what I represent. there's a teacher that did not bend. And in Francis Whittleson, there's a professor amongst the whole thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of professors across our country who didn't bend when everybody else did. So all we ask for is more of us. And Natasha, I know you're on side. And I think this interview is going to bring more on side as well. So thank you for this opportunity.
You're very welcome. We were speaking a little bit before. I think you're my 6th interview, and you're the 2nd teacher that I've interviewed, because in the transformation of Canada into a post-nationalist Marxist experiment, one of the ways in which they've facilitated this very efficiently is to indoctrinate our youth. And so it's very, very important that parents understand what's going on in the classroom and that it matters. The kids aren't going to be able to suss out reality if they're being programmed for over 30 hours a week without any context from their parents. And there's also, I've noticed that what's happening is there are also a lot of people who I would consider more reasonable and rational. They're pulling their children out. So there are even fewer people who are objecting to this terrible indoctrination. So it makes it even more difficult for the children who are in these classrooms to be able to kind of have, I guess, some friends who are in agreement with them. But I think that your story is a good one, because people just need to take a stand. And I know that's easier said than done for some people, but if a critical mass of people take a stand, and it doesn't need to be 50%, it needs to be more like 5. If 5% of people take a stand, it ends the next day. It would end immediately.
Absolutely, particularly if it was a group, if it was a church, if it was, a group of parents at one school that just said no, walked in the principal's office or the board's office and said, nope, we're not bringing your kids to school anymore. The whole school is shutting down until you stop this exploitation of our children. And they know it's wrong. And I think a lot of the educational leadership, in my own view, should be charged criminally. Because they're not looking out for the best interests of children, and I think in some cases they're pushing children toward changing their sex. I couldn't think of anything more obvious. Can I ask who the teacher was that you had on? Was it Chanel Fall?
No, she's wonderful though. I've met her in real life. It was Matt Alexander.
Oh, well, okay. Matt Alexander there's an incredible guy, and his son, Jason Alexander, stood up to his teacher at school, Josh, and I incredible film. And so, what the reality is, there's thousands of teachers that are taking a stand. The only problem is with people like Chanel and Matt and me, is if you do it publicly, they will destroy you. Until there's enough of this. So other teachers are fighting in different ways. And I think together it's the woke house of cards is going to collapse. And I don't think it's long from now.
God willing, because every day that this continues, it's a form of assault on children, and it's an assault on their minds. One of the ways that I preserve my I'm a fairly even person. And one of the ways I preserve that, aside from my feeding my spiritual need in church and prayer, is always telling the truth. And I think that when people are compelled to lie, it chips away at their soul, and it chips away at their own sense of reality. And that it isn't just going on to get along. I think on a soul level, it makes us sick. And so there is a liberating factor in just saying, no, I'll always tell the truth, and I'll always be able to sleep at night, come what may.
Yeah. And they're not doing that. So imagine if you did say that. So I had met one parent who said her daughter has 4 female friends who were all transitioning at the same time. 4. So one of the truths that they're not saying in schools is to the boys and girls who they are encouraging. It's like running, it's like running up the flag every time, they get another trans kid. I got another trans kid at my school. Look at me. I'm woke. They don't use that word. I'm progressive. Look at what I've done. If you said to those kids, you're never going to have children, you change your sex, you're never going to have grandchildren. They don't do that. They don't tell kids. As I said to you earlier, it's about kids have a right to know. If those
they also have a right to know that they'll never experience sexual pleasure. They have no way of knowing they're children, so they don't even know what that would be. They'll be infertile. Like the highest probability is that they'll be infertile. They'll never be able to be a natural parent. They'll also never be anything but a bad facsimile of the opposite sex. And I think it's so much more affirming, to use the language of progressives, to tell a child, you are beautiful just the way you are. You are perfect just the way you are. It's normal to feel many different ways about our bodies as we go through the various stages of life. It's normal during puberty to feel confused sometimes and to feel like the changes are happening too quickly. That's a conversation parents can have with their children. You're beautiful the way you are. You're going to grow into your body. You're going to be fine. You're going to be okay. Like, that's affirming. And that's also realistic. Telling a child, like, chopping off your forearm and trying to fashion a dysfunctional member, which will never be an organ. It's so diabolical that I can't even really wrap my head around it.
But that's it. All this is diabolical. All the things, judging kids on sex and race and taking away literature and so forth. But the thing that's most upsetting about this to me as a teacher is you can't even say what you just said in the classroom. If I said, boys and girls, you're born in the right body.
Yeah, you're beautiful.
I would be snitched. I'd be walked out of that classroom in minutes. Some kid would run out to the principal's office and then they go to the board office. Maybe police would be called. I'd have 2 men on both sides of me. And because that's what happened to me. I had 2 vice principals marking me down. I said, it was almost violent. I was, this is just an absolutely horrible time in our history when school was taxpayers paid for to take care of our children, do what's best for children. The principle in law, if you work as a lawyer with children, is you do what's in the child's best interest. And it's so obvious that teachers and principals and school authorities are doing the very opposite. What they've been doing in recent years is counter to the children's best interests.
Yeah, it has to stop. And I believe that, taking a stand the way you have is a step in the right direction. And it's, you probably didn't anticipate becoming a martyr for this cause, but thank you for becoming a martyr for this cause, because each person who just refuses to kowtow to the Marxism and to the child abuse and who won't participate in it is one person who's having a lot of impact. And I think that the impact is disproportionate. I think that the example of Matt Alexander and Chanel and yourself is really disproportionate, and it's making an impact. I believe that. So I'm grateful. Thank you. And I'm just going to put your book up again. People should buy your book. Where can they find it?
They can find it at jimmcmurtry.com, but they can also find it by just going to my website, which and that's easy to find, where I'm on X. I'm just Googling my name. People will be able to find my Twitter, my X account. So thank you again. Without people like you, my story wouldn't be known.
You're very welcome. I'm doing my best to get the word out. And if people want to help, the best way is to comment, share, And I'll also put the interview up on YouTube as soon as I can, and also on Rumble if people prefer watching on those platforms. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll be in touch. And thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful.